I'm Michelle Guma. I work for the Trustees, and as some of you know, we own 56 community gardens in Boston. And I think about 15 or 17 are actually in Dorchester. There's quite a few. Right here on Josephine Street, there are 2 of them, and this is our first in-garden workshop in a long time. Maybe we should move away from everybody.
Wait, I can't hear you. I'm sorry, I muted you accidentally. Liz,
Oh,
okay,
great.
you're all set, you're all set.
We're good. That's a good problem to have. So we're going to talk about one of my favorite topics on this beautiful April day, which is no-till gardening. So anyone who's been in any classes with me over the last few years has probably heard a little bit about this, but I love no-till. And it's gaining a lot of popularity with farmers of all different scales and gardeners for a lot of reasons. So I think the number one thing that's so great about it is you can take really good care of your soil. You can add a lot of organic matter and not burn it up by turning it a lot, not break up your soil structure by turning it a lot. And that has a whole host of benefits. So you feed the soil food web that lives in your soil. You have organisms, all different kinds, lots of beneficial bacteria and fungi and lots of other little guys who are in there digesting organic matter and making nutrients from leaves and straw and old plant matter available to living plants. So that soil food web is really important to take care of. And if you keep turning it up, especially with a machine, but you can even overdo it with a pitchfork, those little communities get broken up and they don't thrive. And they also burn through or digest organic matter really quickly, so it doesn't stick around and remain available for your plants. There's also the structure of the soil can become very sandy and fine and start falling apart instead of having this nice, what are called soil aggregates that stick together and have, you probably could tell by looking at it, what beautiful, it's a little hard because it's wet today. So all the soil kind of looks compacted but I brought some samples that I'll show you in a minute to see how soil that has really nice aggregates and sticks together and has a nice texture to it. Feels, and anyone who's been gardening for a while sort of knows what that feeling is like. So the other benefits that come from having that soil structure and having the soil food web doing really well is you don't have to water as much because your soil holds on to water better. And you don't have as many weeds because the more you turn your soil, so the soil, especially in a community garden, but in any garden that's been gardened for any length of time, soil is full of weed seeds. You can't do anything about that. They blow all over the place. Some plants can make tens of thousands of seeds from one plant. So you're not going to get rid of the weed seeds. That's not a realistic way to do it. If you don't turn them and expose them to light, most of them won't germinate. As you keep turning them and exposing them to light, you have more and more weeds growing. So we get healthier plants with more access to nutrients, less watering, fewer weeds. Sounds like a great system, right? And you don't have to break your back like double digging or turning everything every year. But it doesn't mean that you can just leave your soil open, not do anything to it, and plant in that. You do have to prep it a little bit and you have to protect it. So I love to see this straw mulch over here. I brought a little sample, but I didn't even need to. Oh, very nice.
We read about it in a book about 8 years ago.
Nice.
Fantastic. Yeah.
So what have you noticed about your soil since you started using straw?
It just, yeah, it holds a lot of water and hardly get any weeds.
And then I bet even in the rain, you could poke under here and see the difference with this soil that's, oh, look at that. So I don't know how easy it is to tell. But do you see all these? This is worm poop, which is great. All these little things are worm castings. So all this soil, that's another great thing about, well, I'll talk a lot about mulch because it's key to no-till. And mulch really allows worms and other insects and other micro or macroorganisms to thrive too. So it's not just little ones that you can't see, but it's earthworms, sow bugs, other decomposers. So we'll put that back to bed. I love mulch. I don't really have a lot of extra time to do weeding during the summer, and I have a big garden. Mulch is the best way to keep the weeds down and to keep the water in. so you don't have to water as much. It
Question-
also creates this really nice, oh yeah, go ahead.
I make my leaves every fall. Is it okay to use those?
I love
I'm
leaves.
gonna have it
Yeah.
there too. I grind them all up with the leaf shredder.
Oh, that's great.
It's okay. I can throw that in
That's
there.
the best, actually. So I love leaves. They're free. They're super sustainable because they're getting parted away anyway. So if you shred them up, the challenge that you alluded to is if you don't shred them up, it's really hard to keep them in place. So if you don't have a leaf shredder or a lawnmower, some people run over piles with a lawnmower. You can do that carefully. Some people use a string trimmer. There's a lot of different ways to do it. Maybe for community gardens, one idea might be to share a leaf blower, or sorry, a leaf shredder. But straw is a great option if you don't have a way to shred leaves. I do a little combination of both. And another way to work with leaves that I'm just starting to do that I really like is make leaf mold. So if you've got a space, like a community garden, you could do it back near their compost or something. You can make as big as you can, because the bigger, sort of the more, just like a compost pile, the bigger it is, the better the decomposition happens. You can make a big pile of leaves in the fall. And even if you don't have a yard or don't have a lot of leaves falling on the garden, everyone puts them out in bags. So you can just grab them. Pile up a big pile of leaves. Sometimes it's helpful to have like some pallets or wire or something to keep it in place, maybe something to weight it down. And you leave it for at least a year and it gets compressed and into this really dark, rich stuff. It's not quite broken down like compost. You can still see bits of leaf in it, but it makes a fantastic mulch or soil amendment. So there's a few different ways to work with leaves. They are great because they break down, they already have a lot of beneficial organisms in them when they, because they're just on the ground, they're not coming from like a farm and like straw is. One more thing about mulch, actually that's a lie. There's going to be several more things about mulch, but the one I want to say now is we used to recommend salt marsh hay and it does work really well. But because there's issues with it, with the sourcing of it and the destruction of salt marshes, which are really important for all kinds of wildlife, including migratory birds, we don't recommend or sell that anymore. We go with straw, which is a byproduct of growing grains. You don't want to get mulch hay, which means it's like overgrown pasture hay fields from horses or cows, because those tend to have a lot of seeds in them. So I would go straw or leaves.
Someone's asking about wood chips.
Great question. I love wood chips for pathways. They're a little bit tricky to use in garden beds. So they're great for perennials or trees or fruiting shrubs or any shrubs. But for our annual vegetables need a lot of nitrogen. And if you put a lot of wood chips, which are very high carbon, onto the soil, then what happens is as the bacteria that we were talking about earlier try to break down those wood chips, they need a lot of nitrogen to do it, because bacteria need a certain balance of carbon and nitrogen in order to do their work. And so they're decomposing. So as they're doing that, they're taking nitrogen out of the soil and it's not available to your plants anymore. So if you do use wood chips, which you can do, you just need to make sure that you're supplementing with a lot of nitrogen. So either something like fish emulsion or dehydrated chicken manure, coffee grounds. Compost is okay, but it's balanced in nitrogen and carbon, and you want something that's really high nitrogen to help with that. So I would use wood chips cautiously. I love them for pathways so that you can get, because they have a lot of benefits. So they encourage earthworms and they really encourage beneficial fungi even more than anything else. That fungi really like wood. And if you break into a pile of rotting wood chips, you'll see all these white threads that are mycelium or mushrooms. So that is really good stuff for your soil, really important for the soil food web. But you can get some of the benefits if you use pathways within your garden or around your garden made of wood chips and use straw or leaves inside. That's probably the easiest way to go for growing veggies. But absolutely for perennials and the other plants that I mentioned, flower gardens, that kind of thing. And it's easy to get them free. There's this site called Chip Drop, or you can like make friends with your town's arborist or a local landscaper, and usually they'll dump more than you want, so that can be a problem. But if you are using wood chips, go with hardwood. Conifers have things in them that prevent the growth. A good mechanism for making sure that you're not crowded in the forest, but it's not good for the garden. A note on straw, some local sources, I think Allendale sells it. Some of the other local farms that have plant sales sell it. And if you're close to Mattapan, we have it at City Natives. We just got in a whole load of nice clean straw. So we have a nursery called City Natives, which you can shop. It's all online, shop online, and then you can come pick stuff up. It's right near Mattapan Square on Edgewater Drive, and we've got a bunch of straw there. And if a garden wanted to get a load, we would deliver, 4 or 5 bales. We make it with using a truck to deliver them. So if your other gardeners are inspired by you, you can do that. I think it is kind of expensive. That's the downside of straw, and the upside of leaves, that they're free. But a bale would cover more than a plot probably. So, your plots are pretty big, but definitely wouldn't be more than 1 bale per plot. So that's like $12 or something like that, and it lasts. Like I reuse it. It's especially important to protect your soil over the winter. I think all season it's important, but over the winter there's a lot of rain and hopefully snow, and it can leach nutrients out, and a lot of compaction can happen. The other thing that straw does, or any kind of mulch does, is create a nice buffer from temperature extremes. So all those beneficial organisms in the soil get, they're happier if they are not freezing one day and baking in the sun the other day, but they have a nice little blanket over them. A couple of words of caution with straw. Of course, if you're direct seeding something, any small seeds, then you need to move it away and make sure it doesn't blow back on. If you are trying to plant things early in the season, any mulch does keep the soil insulated, so it either keeps it warmer or cooler depending on what temperature it was when you put the straw on. So if you want your soil to warm up faster, you can move the straw aside and let the sun hit it for a couple of days in the spring, and that will help. If you kept your soil pretty loose and you haven't walked on it a lot and you put mulch on it, you might not need to do that much prep in the spring at all. But there is a little prep. So I'm going to grab my pitchfork. Meantime, if there's any questions, I feel like I've been talking nonstop. Nothing?
We hit them.
Okay.
Is only all trees are good? All 3 leaves are good? Doesn't matter what
Oh,
tree.
that's a great question. So some people, there's a
Hey,
couple.
Michelle.
Yes.
One thing is, it's easier to hear you than other people asking questions.
sure,
So
I'll
do you
Repeat the question.
Okay, so the question, it was a great question, whether all tree leaves are good. So just like with the wood chips, no pine needles or anything evergreen, because they're pretty acidic, and they inhibit the growth of broadleaf plants, just like the wood does. And then black walnut has this chemical in it called jugalone, I think you say it, that suppresses the growth of other plants. So if you ever see a black walnut tree, usually there's not much, maybe a little grass, but not much growing under them, which is again like a great strategy for a plant, but not great. That chemical mostly comes from the roots of the plant, but it can come from there's some of it in the leaves itself. So you try to keep leaves and wood chips of black walnut out of the garden too. But other than that, you're pretty much okay. I like oak leaves for making leaf mold. For shredding, I find like somewhat thinner leaves like maple, elm, ash, birch. Those are a little bit more papery and a little bit just easier to deal with and shred. But you can, if you have a strong enough shredder, oak is totally fine too.
Do the nurseries sell like shredded leaves, or is that something that you have to do
I have
yourself?
never seen, I've never seen anyone sell that, but I have seen people sell leaf mold. So rotted leaves, which are really pretty good mulch too, and really great to add to the soil. So I think that Landscape Express on American Legion, which is the same company that supplies our compost, might also provide leaf. And sometimes they have leaf mold. I'm not positive, but that's a great question. I've never seen it anywhere else. Maybe as more people are getting into it, it'll start being a thing. And we don't have a big scale shredder for leaves like that. Otherwise, I would actually love to do that. Maybe we should get one, and then people can just take buckets of bags. That would be nice. I'm gonna grab a pitchfork.
Sorry,
Oh,
quick
yeah.
question. Is there any downside to using leaf as mulch, or year after year, or like a leaf compost? Like, isn't there any issues like acidification? Like
Good question. They're not. Most of them are not too acidic. Although it is a good idea while we're talking about that to test your soil every couple of years, and that will include pH.
Repeat the question.
Oh, sorry, I forgot to repeat it. So the question was, is there any downside to using leaves year after year? So there's a couple things. One is that just like wood chips, but much less so, they are high in carbon. So you want to pay attention to the nitrogen levels in your soil and make sure that you're providing enough nitrogen. Nitrogen is usually it's like the main nutrient for plant growth. Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, but nitrogen is the one that usually limits their growth. You don't want to overdo it. So it really is helpful to test your soil, and it's only 15, maybe 20 if you add lead, if that's a concern. Dollars, you send it off to Umass. This time of year, they're pretty busy. So it's a great thing to do in the fall, but you can do it. You just have to wait to get your results. And it's the Umass soil testing lab. Annabelle, maybe you can put that in the chat, or people can Google it too, but it's they give you pretty good directions on sampling. You want to make sure you follow those so that you get a representative sample of your whole garden. Your test results are only as good as your sample, and then they give you pretty good recommendations for how to, whether something is low, moderate, optimum, or excessive, and how you can amend it. So it's worth doing that. Not every year, but I would say like every 2-3 years, it's pretty useful information. And they'll also give you the pH. I haven't had any issues with leaves making things too acidic. It definitely, of course, can happen with pine needles. In fact, that's a great way to mulch like blueberry bushes. But as long as you have sufficient nitrogen, it's pretty good. There is one thing to be careful of. You want to make sure there's no paint chips or like street sweepings working into your leaves. In the city, that can be an issue, and you don't want to be adding lead to your soil.
There's a question from the chat. Any problem with reusing straw mulch year after year?
So the only reason I do it, the only thing to be careful of is diseases. So if you had if you had fungal diseases specifically, those can, the spores can be protected, in the mulch. I guess the same is true of certain pests. And some pests, notably slugs, I'm thinking of them on this rainy spring day, they like mulch. So you have to balance that. They really love things like a little protected wet place to be. So you get a few more pests, but I think the overall balance, the soil is so much healthier, the plants are so much healthier, they're able to fight off disease and pests better. One thing I would say is if you know that you have a bunch of powdery mildew or a bunch of tomato fungal diseases, then maybe use that straw somewhere for a different plant family that doesn't get the same diseases, or move your plants around but leave the straw in the same place. A little bit hard to do crop rotation like that in a small garden. It's kind of meaningless in a 15 by 15 plot, whatever, or 10 by 10 plot. But if you have a larger garden, that's worth doing. Anything else?
One more question about if leaves suffocate perennials. Someone had heard that might be a problem.
I've not. It's an interesting question because I have actually heard some concerns about that. I think that the shredding is a nice way to make sure that a good oxygen exchange can still happen, versus just like matted full leaves. You've seen probably oak leaves when they start to break down, they can really mat and get slimy, so that suggests there's not a lot of oxygen exchange happening, which isn't ideal. But I use whole leaves on my perennial garden, and they seem pretty fluffy. I'm not watering all the time, it's not in a super wet area, so there seems to be plenty of air, and the plants can definitely come up through them. If that was the question, they can definitely come up through them. Some things, like if you have, sometimes people like to move, say you cover your strawberries with straw, you might want to move that off into the pathways or out of the bed in the spring. But for the most part, vigorous perennials, especially natives, which tend to be pretty vigorous, can come up through a little bit. And we should talk amounts. So if you want the mulch to really be effective, you don't want to see much soil through it. So how thick it is or how thick it needs to be depends on what the material is, but something between like 3 and 5 inches, 3 or 4 is pretty good for most materials. And I mean, when you first put on straw mulch, it might be really fluffy, but if it compresses down to 3 inches or so, that's about what you want.
If I wanted to add more soil, let's say to my garden, so that I could nourish it a little bit more, what kind of soil should I get?
It can be hard to get good quality. Oh, what kind of soil should somebody add who's looking to add soil to their garden? That was the question. So, one thing is that all the stuff we're talking about, especially shredded leaves, will break down into soil over time. So you might be able to get away with just adding more organic matter like that rather than adding more soil. But if you just like don't have enough and your raised bed needs more or something, usually I recommend a mix of half compost, half loam, or something close to that. There are lots of different companies now that do that. So depending where you live, Landscape Express might be close. You live around here, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, so that's probably the closest place where you can get just compost if you want. But if you're growing in a raised bed and you just keep adding compost to it, it tends to lack for some minerals because compost has a lot of nutrients, but it doesn't have a lot of minerals from broken down rock the way that soil does. So getting a mix of the two, like a sandy loam compost mix.
so you have to let them know that it's good.
Yeah.
Like for community garden, so that they know.
If you're doing it here, so we just do compost just because that's what we can get. Soil is a little bit harder to get. That you'll be getting like a load of compost here, and that's usually sufficient. One thing you can do is when any of the rock base show up, then you can actually bring just those sorry, I said nutrients, I meant minerals. You can bring those minerals in as like green sand or sometimes people put a little bit of fine stone dust or sand to sort of add a little structure and more minerals to go with the compost. So if you feel like you need that, you can do it. But a soil test would probably be helpful for you to know that. So the tricky thing about getting soil is that it's usually scraped from somewhere, and there's lead in most of the soil around here because there's so many old houses with lead paint, plus the remnants of leaded gasoline. So it's hard to find clean soil where it's easier to find clean compost. So that's something, if you're going to bring in new soil, it's always good to ask to see their tests just to make sure you're not starting with lead.
If you do a soil test and the result says like you need to add more minerals, like the green sand or whatever you said, how do you work that into the existing soil, or you just sprinkling it on top?
I think working it in the fall is ideal because those things take kind of a long time to break down. You do want to work it in a little bit. So there's sometimes when you do have to turn your soil a little bit, and that's one of them, I would say, because they're heavy, they don't move that easily in the soil. So whereas if you put something with nitrogen on it, the nitrogen will wash down through the soil. If you're putting in minerals, you probably do want to mix them in at least into the top like 6 inches or so.
Okay.
It doesn't mean you need to till, but just sprinkle and turn with the spading fork. Anything else?
Nope.
All right, let me grab this. So I just brought a couple of my most handy garden tools to show you. Okay, thank you. Also, as a side note, I just want to show, I was collecting some wood chips. I don't know why I thought you need to see what wood chips look like, but I thought, hey, we'll have a sample. So I was collecting some wood chips and I noticed right under them, these were from my garden, was this awesome, like kind of loose, friable is a word for it. Like it's easy to work. It's easy for water and nutrients to penetrate it. Right under the wood chips, the soil just looked so nice. I don't know if it really is showing up in this little container, but I just want to try to point that out. Okay, so let's say I had mulched my garden for the fall, and even if not, and I'm ready to prep in the spring. So first thing, I mean, yeah, the dead nettles everywhere. So there'll be some weeding. You know, straw can keep down a lot of weeds, but it's not a miracle worker. Dead nettle, dead nettle. So it's a knit family plant. I think the seed has been spread over the years in the compost and community gardens, and it's just like very prominent everywhere. So some perennial weeds will definitely be able to come up through straw, like grasses and that. So I would just lift aside my mulch, and then I'm just gonna push inside to get a feeling. This is pretty loose, so I don't feel like it needs a lot. But what I like to do to loosen the soil is just use a flat tined fork like this. It's often called a pitchfork, but it's actually a digging or spading fork. A pitchfork has rounded tines. This was flat. Just put it the depth of that, of the tool, and then, oh, look at those nice worms. Side note, sorry guys. And we've got other, oh yeah, little centipedes. This is good. This is a nice little ecosystem in here. And it's a little hard to tell because it's wet, so things look a little more heavy, but there is nice soil structure in here. You can kind of see like roots are penetrating it. There's air holes in it. That's good. That's what we're looking for. And they have been mulching for several years and taking good care of the soil, so you can really see it, which is nice.
So you wouldn't turn it over, you just lift
Yeah,
it up.
I loosen it like this, and then it's hard to tell right now because of the rain. If it wasn't super wet and it wasn't compacted, I might just leave it like that. But if it felt chunky, then I sometimes kind of break up the clods like that, so that it's especially if you're going to plant seeds, so you have something a little looser. But I'm not, and I'll just do an example of this. I'm not going like that. Now your soil looks good pretty far down, but often if you flip soil, you're just taking the really rich topsoil that's on the top and like putting it farther away from where the plants are growing and putting like sandy or clay or soil on top. The top 3 to 4 inches, in this case, maybe down to like 6, because it looks like you have good organic matter in here, are really rich. And you want to make sure that that's where the plant's roots, that's what they're getting. And most vegetable plants roots are really surprisingly shallow. You probably know this when you pull them up at the end of the year. You have this huge tomato plant, but its roots, a lot of them are in those first few inches of soil, like the vast majority of them. Perennials are a whole different story. They can go down way deeper over time, but most of our vegetables are really just occupying that top 6 inches. So you want to make sure that that's where things are especially good. You don't want to have like a hard pan though, just 6 inches down, because then roots can't penetrate, they can't find water as easily, they can't find nutrients as easily. So you do kind of want to know, you know, I'm like gonna just dig this down a little bit. If I felt something, a lot of resistance, that might tell me, okay, this soil needs a little more loosening before I start the whole no-till process, or before I, you know, really leave it alone. So you can maybe do that with a spading fork. Another tool that people use is called a broad fork. It's basically a big wide version of this where you can put your whole body on it and loosen up the soil that way. And really, that's another tool where you can't flip soil with it. So it really keeps you from doing the wrong thing. It just lets you break up. The other thing that's really good at breaking up soil, which is why this dead nettle isn't so bad, is living plant roots. So both your vegetables, then cover crop, which is a whole nother topic. It can be pretty hard to do in a small garden. You have the garden, like managing it, making sure that you kill it at the right time and it doesn't become a weed. It can be a little hard, but there are a few examples, so we can talk about that if people are interested in sort of, you know, a few ideas. So I just want to make sure I'm not blabbing for too long. Okay, so cover crop is any crop that you grow for the benefit of the soil more than for your own benefit. So people use clover, alfalfa. That's less common around here. Very common around here are rye, vetch, oats, and peas. Rye and vetch are two that I recommend kind of steering clear of unless you're prepared to till, because it can be pretty hard to kill them with just like hand tools. They're really great because they germinate in the colder weather, so you can do them at the end of the season, but then they can become perennial weeds if you don't have a way to manage them. So on a larger scale, a lot of farmers are using those and using these rolling crimping machines that will kill the plants, and they can plant right into the old, like the mulch essentially that's created from them. But for us, since we don't have roller crimpers for the garden scale, it can be pretty hard to get rid of those things once you get them established. But I love oats and peas because they winter kill. So you can sow them under your existing plants. So let's say you've got like broccoli or kale into the fall. In early to mid-September, you can take oat and pea seed. And those are available online from various garden centers. We, I think, have some at City Natives for sale, although I may not be on the website yet. I'll check that later. So those are things you could sow either in the spring, but if you sow them in the spring, they're going to just keep growing until you have a way to kill them. So if for some reason you can't garden your whole plot, or you are trying to get something ready to garden in the future year, then you can cover crop with something like that in the spring. But if you want to cover crop in the fall, you can do it in like early September. You'll get a couple months of growth before they die. And then they'll die and they'll just make a great mulch right on the surface of your soil, and you don't have to get rid of them. You can move them aside just like any other mulch to plant. And then, I mean, you think the soil under mulch looks good, but the soil under cover crop mulch, where there's been a living root and then it's died and it's protected the soil, is like primo. Because plant roots exude a lot of compounds that feed that soil food web that we were talking about, even more than like leaves or something like that. They produce sugars, they exude chemicals that the soil food web likes and thrives on. And so you get really healthy soil if you have a living plant root in the soil as much as possible. But for us gardeners, it's totally a very good second to just focus on having some kind of organic matter protecting the soil all year round. I brought another tool to show you, which is not so relevant on a mulchy place without too many weeds, but I don't know how many people are familiar with this. It's called, it has a lot of names: scuffle hoe, stirrup hoe. My favorite is hula hoe, I think, because you kind of look like you're hulaing when you use it. But I like this because it's a good way to kill small weeds without turning over a bunch of soil. So the way you use it, here's some small weeds right here. Well, let me just make sure that so I'm going to run it back and forth. And as you can see, it's just disturbing like this, less than an inch in the top of the soil. And that's enough to kill small weeds, especially annual weeds. It won't really work for grasses and stuff like that, without having turned over a bunch of new weed seeds. So if you have a lot of weeds and you don't want to be like down on your hands and knees scuffling with your hands, which I used to be like, oh, your hands are the best tool. And they are, but like, as I'm getting older, I'm realizing sometimes you don't want to be on your hands and knees scuffling in the soil. This is a useful tool. So, and these are used a lot on farms where, you know, it's easy to get pathways in between plants on small farms that, you know, aren't tractor reliant. So this is a nice tool. I do think your hands are pretty amazing tools. They're so dexterous. They're directly connected to your brain, so it's easy to not mess up. But exactly, if you can't, you know, we got someone over here being like, what about my back? So exactly. That I also really like these to come with these really long handles, so you're not doing any weird bending to get them. So, and other than that, I feel like mostly what you need is just, you know, I often have gardeners, what are the tools I need? I feel like I can do pretty much everything I need to do with these two, and a flat rake. A flat metal rake is a nice thing to prepare a seed bed. And then otherwise it's just your hands paying attention. Yeah. Yeah, great question. So I have, let's see, I've got,
Repeat the question.
Oh, sorry. The question was, is now a good time to start some seeds? So it's cold, as you know, so you definitely want to only do crops that can handle that. I might even wait personally, and I'm more on the cautious side. I'm like, if I just wait, I won't waste any seed and I won't stress the plants. For like things like carrots and radishes, I might wait a little bit. Or no, sorry, carrots and beets. Radishes I would probably plant right now. They're so vigorous. But there's a lot of cold hardy greens that you can plant right now. So there's a lot of Asian greens, mustard family greens that are really cold hardy and delicious. So I have tatsoi and mizuna and a bunch of different mustards seeded already, and peas, of course. So peas, they always say, you know, as soon as the soil can be worked. I think you can do it too early. They just kind of hang out and they don't grow that much, but definitely now is a great time. Anytime in like late March to mid-April is a good time for peas. Then it can actually get kind of late, because sometimes, even though it feels impossible now, it's going to be 70 on Tuesday, I guess. So sometimes the temperature really spikes in the spring and the peas don't like that. So getting them in, you know, sometime in those like end of March, beginning of April is great. What else? What else is good to plant now? What am I not thinking? Lettuce next? Zucchini, yes. So do you direct seed it? I would wait a couple weeks. So a great, actually, I said these are the only tools and I meant it, but I might have forgotten one other thing that I find really fun is to measure the soil temperature. because a lot of plants, like it's hard to tell what's going on and what exactly is going to happen with the weather. But for seed germination, honestly, air temperature is a lot less important than soil temperature. You don't need like a fancy specific thermometer as long as you're fine using a kitchen thermometer and then cleaning it off. Any kind of like digital or dial thermometer that has like a little spot, put it a couple inches into the ground. You know, it's just the top inch or two where your seeds are going to go. So, and then there's lots of charts on optimum germination ranges. There's big ranges for them, but for zucchini, I actually don't know that one off the top of my head. I would guess that you want the soil temperature to be like 65 to 75 for anything in that family, zucchini, cucumbers, melons. And I would also guess that we're not there, that we're more like in the 50s right now. And soil can take a long time to warm up. You know, it holds a lot of moisture, so it holds on to the temperature. And it's really worth waiting because otherwise the seeds just kind of languish, they might rot, they might get eaten by hungry rodents. So if they sprout quickly, they're, you know, they're in, if you put them in at the right time and they sprout quickly, it's much better than putting them early and having them just hang out. Yeah, I just started zucchini and stuff in our greenhouse, but that's if it's going to be 3 weeks before I transplant it out, and then I assume that it'll be warm enough by then. And then I would say like melons and winter squash, even a little later, they really like things warm. And this is actually one of, between overwatering and early planting, I think are like the two most common, and overcrowding, the three most common mistakes for gardeners with not as much experience. So, which I'm not saying you are, I know you are, but I think it's really tempting. You're like, well, if I put it in earlier, I'll get it earlier, but waiting for the time that really makes sense for that crop is important. And making sure that even though you're just planting one seed or one transplant, you keep in mind how big it's going to get. I really recommend using these guidelines instead of the ones that are on seed packets and catalogs, which are really not for urban gardeners. They're like, give your melons 4 feet. And you're like, I would have 2 melons and nothing else in my plot, right? So the intensive spacing guidelines, which if you just Google that, you'll find tons of them and they're all pretty much the same. That works on the principle that you don't need to plant widely spaced rows of vegetables in a small plot, but instead you can space the rows as far as you would space an individual plant within a row. So you don't have to do rows, you can do kind of patches and it's more efficient and they're closer spaced, but it's still sufficient. But you still don't want to overcrowd. So I find square foot gardening, there's a lot of resources out there that tell you to put like 1 tomato in a square foot, and that's just not going to lead to success. So I would take those with a grain of salt. There is, the Food Project has a growing guide. They have some great resources. So if you look on the Food Project website, or if you just Google the Food Project growing guide, they have some of the only square foot spacing I've ever seen that is actually like in line with plant needs. So it's a great resource. They are a great resource in general. And yes, and then I mentioned overwatering. So plants need to be kept moist when they're first growing, for sure, like when you're first transplanting them. And you know, if you start watering seeds or if they get rained on, you want to keep them wet, because once they start germinating, they're very, very fragile. Like they're in a state where if they've started to sprout and then they dry out, they don't have any resources to get water for themselves. However, it's really common. I swear to God, even on days like this, I have gone to gardens and seen people watering. What are you doing? It's the way we love our plants, I think. And so I would really encourage you to love your plants by like just paying attention to them and seeing what they need versus by just giving them what you think they need. I mean, that's like a great just way to love anything. If you think about it. And a great test is just to stick your finger an inch or two into the soil. If it's moist, your plant doesn't need water. And if it's dry, but it's going to rain that day and you're sure of that, it also doesn't need water. The more you water, the more you leach nutrients out of the soil, you wash them out. So you want to do it when you need to. And then obviously there's the environmental reason to not overwater, to not waste water. And mulch is like, I know I've already mentioned this, but I'm just going to re-mention it. It's like a fantastic way to not water very much. I love drip irrigation, I think, because I learned by farming and then came into gardening. It's not always practical for gardening, but if it is, a soaker hose or irrigation tape under mulch can be a really great way to get just the soil watered. You don't wet the leaves, which is good. because that can lead to fungal diseases if the leaves are wet for too long. And you don't lose a bunch of water to evaporation, sunlight. It just goes where it needs to go. And if you can't do that, you can try to mimic it by using like a relatively gentle soak when you water, not like spraying too hard, and trying to really aim for the roots of the plant rather than the leaves. While we're on the subject, and it's a little off no-till, but it's relevant for most of us. The morning is the ideal time to water. A lot of people will say morning or evening, but I think that comes from our understanding of like lawns and ornamentals. Most vegetables are susceptible, or a lot of vegetables are susceptible to different fungal diseases. And if you water at night, the leaves stay wet for a long time, and it's much more likely that fungal spores can get going. So like almost all the diseases that we get in tomatoes and cucumbers, squashes, etc., are fungal. So making sure that we don't have wet leaves is a great way to minimize that. I actually, even though this goes against what a lot of people say, I would prefer to water like at noon than at night, because once plants are established, I really haven't had scorching be a problem. It's a problem with really delicate young plants. But if you water at midday for plants that are established, I think that's better. For community gardens, it's not always practical to get here in the morning before you go to work or whatever. So if you can get here at lunchtime and water, that's fine. Any questions?
There's a few in the chat.
Great.
There's one, someone has a lot of creeping Charlie in their garden, and they're wondering if that scraping tool will be enough to get rid of them.
Not really. It might help you, but I honestly think hand weeding for that, because it doesn't have deep roots. So this is, by the way, this creeping Charlie is another mint family plant. It has kind of round scallop leaves. I actually don't see, it's like the henbit is like filling that. We're sorry, the dead nettle is like filling that niche in this garden. So I don't see it, but we have a ton of it at City Natives. It is actually kind of a cool medicinal. So that's just like a side note. You can use it. It has a lot of the same medicinal benefits as any other mint. So it's good for digestion, it's cooling. But anyway, that's a side note. I know you weren't asking how to use it here, but if you pull it up rather than then you can use, clean it up and use it for tea or something like that. But I don't think, for most perennials, these aren't that great. What they're great at is cutting just below the soil surface where a seed has germinated, and like kind of keep cutting it off from its roots. So that's like for annual weeds that propagate themselves by seed dispersal. But for perennials that have runners and stuff like that, it's not as effective. I think your hands, or you could try to use it, but you'd have to use it more like to dig, kind of like that, and then you'd still have to do some. I obviously didn't do that very well, but you still have to do some more pulling to get anything that has rhizomes. I mean, this grass is a lot worse than creeping Charlie as far as difficulty pulling it up. So you could try, but I think unfortunately it's mostly your hands. You could use a bigger hoe, but you just want to not chop up the soil more than you need to.
Someone's also wondering if tilling is more of an industrial farming practice, or can the soil loosening I do by hand in my 8x10 plot be too aggressive and disturb the soil too much?
Yeah, that is a really great question. It can be, surprisingly, it can be. So the method that we showed of like loosening the soil and breaking up the clods, but not flipping it over and really breaking it up, that's the way that you can still, loosen your soil and aerate it a little and make a soft place for the plants, but without really turning it over. I have definitely seen over-tilled, hand-tilled plots. People get really into digging down a foot and flipping everything over. Flipping is like it does kill weeds. There's a reason people do it, but it also has all these other negative effects. So, and then a lot of people, even in garden plots, do use rototillers, like hand push rototillers, and they're actually like the worst. They're worse than what people use on farms because they heat up the soil. They really break up the aggregates into very small particles, and basically create like much sandier soil, which is much more likely to compact. Actually, I want to say one more thing about compaction, then we can go to the other questions. So another thing that can really help in the no-till garden is to have stepping stones or set pathways, because It's surprising, but especially when it's wet, just our own walking through our garden can compress it a fair bit, and then you have to loosen it more. So better to like skip that whole cycle and try to have set places where you walk. Now in the spring and fall, when you're like prepping the whole garden, that can be hard to do, but at least throughout the season, to try not to be walking all over the place. And I find I don't really have like the discipline to do that unless I have set things. So if you can make a path that makes like a loop around the garden so that you try to minimize the amount of space you give to path, of course, or like if you're up for it, hopping from stone to stone, that takes even less growing space.
True that you should never work soil or plant in the rain when soil is wet.
I think planting in the rain is fine, but I wouldn't. I think the reason that people don't want to work soil is because when the soil is wet, it's much more prone to compaction. So then if you stand on wet soil, it squishes down, and then it dries that way, and it has a harder time pushing back up. So I think if you're going to do it, it's fine, but just make sure you're watching where you step and not like running the whole place. And I think that also comes from tractor farming, where you certainly don't want to run a tractor in the wet, because that causes a huge amount of compaction. Yeah.
Do you have this invasive kind of grower up against the fence? And I mean, I've tried to kill this thing for like the last 8 years, and it always runs underneath the garden. And so when I pull it, and I'm in the back now, and so now I have to. It's still.
Oh, is it knotweed?
Huh?
Should we go take a look?
No, it's this one right here. Right there. The one that's growing right there, and it's spiny. That green one. Yep. If you pull that, it's really raining and it goes like into the garden. So sometimes when you pull, you're pulling like, I'm talking about like, you can pull all the way like.
Yeah.
Is there any way to like pull that at the wall without damaging the garden?
Geez. Okay, I don't.
Have to, like break it from the bottom.
Yeah, if
So
you can
now
pick
you're
it out.
over there, and like, I noticed last year I had a lot. And I tried to pull it out, but I
Yeah.
don't know how successful I was.
So
I got
vines
really
are some of
busy
the
with the
hardest things to get
pandemic.
rid of.
Huh?
Vines are some of the hardest things, as you know, to get rid of, because you leave like 6 inches and it
Yeah,
sprouts from that. I know it's not very helpful, but you just kind of have to keep after it, like keep doing what you're doing, and eventually you'll sort of help to beat it back. If there was a way to.
Yeah, no, that was all over. Like that was, you could see the wall. That was all over the wall.
So if this like wasn't a food garden, if it was a natural area that someone was trying to get rid of invasives in, honestly, the way to do it would be to cut that and like paint, like just spot apply a little bit of herbicide, and it would go down and kill it. But you really don't want to do that in the garden. So, and you should have, anyone who's handling that kind of chemicals should have training in doing that. So unfortunately, I think you just have to keep doing what you're doing. Sorry.
I cut it right from the bottom.
I mean, I see there's a ton here. It looks awful.
So mine is a really bad looking because I had to kind of like stop at a certain. I got really busy, and my husband he's really lazy.
There's another element of no-till weed control that we didn't talk about, which is called solarization or occultation. They're both methods of putting down some plastic. Here, I'll come closer. So you can basically use tarps. So you might want to do that. I don't know how to kill the dead nettle, but
Like a
you can
blue
use it.
tarp.
Oh,
you
a
can
tarp,
put down,
yeah.
like often people use silage tarps, which is just whatever. It doesn't matter. Just use some kind of plastic.
Yeah, like those
Um,
blue ones.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
As long as it's like not going to break down. So you don't want to leave it in for too long or use it too many times, because those blue ones, like they're woven and they will start to break down over time.
Yeah.
But you can try to just smother weeds for a few weeks before you plant, and see
So
if
like
that
you see all
helps.
those weeds that I
Yeah.
have? If I was to get a tarp and put it over there, like right now, let's say, and pin it on the corners, would you think that it'll kill those weeds?
I think you should try. I think
Okay.
it will. It may not kill all of them, but it
But
will
it'll
kill
kill-
some
it
of
won't
them and
kill
make it a
them.
little easier for you to, for you to deal with what's left.
Listen, I'm in my 50s, so it hurts really bad. When
Yeah,
I'm
that's
out
a lot.
there
I
taking
know.
all that out.
Um,
And normally I leave it like really clean before I plant. So.
it happens. Last year was a weird year, especially like it happens. I think trying the tarping is probably your best bet. Ideally, you'd be able to leave it on for 3 or 4 weeks. So if you don't mind waiting,
Yeah.
I mean, just keep checking and see how things are doing. Do we have any more questions that we missed? Okay. Does anyone have any more questions? I think we've been over the main things. I think we're a little early. I think we.
If we're gonna get compost, I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah.
What's the best compost? And like, where can we get it? Like, we used to get it before, and I don't know how we did it.
You're gonna get it.
Oh,
You
we're gonna get
ordered.
it this
You ordered
year?
some, right?
Yeah, they're gonna try to do it next week.
Oh, good. You talked to them. Great. I'm so glad
Awesome.
they're
Yeah, 'cause
starting
they dump
deliveries
it
now.
right there.
Yeah, they need to do that. They need to.
Well, we don't
Yeah,
have
I
we
haven't
don't have a key for that. I don't
So
think
I think
because-
for the, we're probably gonna talk a little bit more, but if there's no more Zoom questions, we can
For that
officially
one?
end that.
Yeah.
part. Thanks.
Oh,
Your
okay.
hands must be freezing.
They're a little cold.
Thank you so much
So
for
put it down.
making that work.
All right.
Thanks, everybody. We have more workshops coming up on high yield gardening and vegetable gardening 101 and some kids cooking and all of that. So check out the trustees.org/seed so if you're interested in any of that.